So, I was aimlessly scrolling social media, you know, like you do, and I came across a tagline from a theater for an upcoming show because I get targeted theater ads. It makes sense. And this tagline said, "You've never met a hero like Lucy Snow." And I said, "You want to bet?" So I'd somehow missed that we are getting a production of Villette this year at the Lookingglass Theatre in Chicago. Now, they do pronounce it Villette instead of Villette. My friend Mandy had been using Villette, and I kind of conceded to her because she knows French and I don't, and she took a whole class on the Brontes, which is where she had read Villette. And we had bonded early in our friendship over this book because we were out at the bar talking about the Brontes like the nerds we are, talking about our kind of ranking of the Brontes. We have been known to yell obscenities about Emily Brontë in a bar more than once, which I guess illustrates the exact kind of nerd I am. I don't know. But a couple of years ago, we both reread this book together because we both remembered loving it, but we hadn't read it in a while. And for me, there was one scene in particular that really stood out and was what I remembered, and it was Lucy getting locked in an attic to study these lines for a play for a party. And that was like basically all I could remember. So seeing this ad, I realized very quickly, I'm like, what do I remember from my last reread? And I felt really guilty about it because I love this book and I've revisited it multiple times, and it follows a young woman who is left bereft and kind of isolated. She has multiple tragedies in her past, though she doesn't really tell us what those are, and she goes to become a nanny governess and eventual English teacher abroad in this kind of fictional place. And when I say because she doesn't tell us, I mean that very literally because this is told in the first person. And as a reader, that feels like it deviates from what I am used to from literature around this time. Now, the caveat being that I didn't study literature or English in college, so I'm really coming at this as a nerd and not a scholar, but I'm used to these books being told either through third person, omnipresent third person, or through a first person, but from an outsider coming in, like we get in Wuthering Heights, which I admittedly don't like. It is my least favorite Brontë novel, and I think that Anne is overlooked a lot because I much prefer her books. We can revisit those together if you would like as well. And there is also a production of Wuthering Heights going on at Chicago Shakespeare right now. We kind of have the Battle of the Brontes for the week or two. They overlap because that production is ending and Villette is running through April, I believe. It is just getting started. I went to a final preview, and for full disclosure, I know one of the artists on the design team, and he is a fantastic sound designer, and the design in this really informs the whole show. And at the end of the day, it was an incredibly exciting piece of theater that succinctly distilled this book I love, but also deviated from the original text because of that need to kind of tighten. And so I wanted to talk about this book and Lucy Snow as a protagonist, particularly in kind of reference and framed by this production. So I know most of you will not have probably seen this production. If you are in Chicago or will be in Chicago at any point in the next couple of months, I would really urge you to check it out. It's at Lookingglass, which is downtown right next to Water Tower Place Mall, so it's really easy to get to. And if you're unfamiliar with the Chicago theater scene, which is multifaceted and varied, and even I can't speak to it at its full depth and vibrancy, Lookingglass is one of the preeminent kind of storefront theaters, but storefront in the sense of what kind of theater it is producing. It's one of the larger houses in the city in terms of like budget of operations. It has a regional theater Tony, and it is an equity house in terms of the contracts it offers its actors. And when I say storefront in Chicago, it's this kind of idea of this smaller, more intimate, and often stripped down form of storytelling. And so there is still this intense spectacle to the shows going on in Chicago, but there is also an incredible intimacy, and there is a use of theatricality in a different way, and it pulls audiences into the narrative in a different way. And I say this as a theatergoer who does not really enjoy the fourth wall being broken at me, in the sense that I don't tend to like audience participation. And so there's a lot of opportunity in terms of the storytelling, and I think that this storytelling landscape is perfect for something like Villette, which is a lot more intimate in terms of Bronte's body of work. I will admit I was a little disappointed to see a dramaturg wasn't involved in this process. I know personally that Lookingglass doesn't have a huge history of working with dramaturgs to my knowledge, so it wasn't necessarily surprising, but having been involved as a dramaturg in a production of Alias Grace in Chicago, I also know how rewarding that is. But why do I say that this form of storytelling really serves the source material? And when I say this form of storytelling, I mean both theater and this particular kind of theater, this very intimate kind of theater. And I think that it goes back again to how the story is told in the book. This is a first person recounting, which when we look at the way different kinds of stories are being translated to the screen, for instance, we have Daisy Jones and the Six coming up, which was really inventive and groundbreaking in some ways in terms of how it was telling its story in book form, and seeing that translated to the screen in a more understood and conventional form and shape of storytelling. So when we're comparing to things like that, it may not seem as big of a narrative hurdle to get over that this is in first person, especially because we are so used to that today. But Lucy Snowe is an interesting narrator, and I think when it goes back to the tagline of "You've never met a hero like Lucy Snowe," it's this idea of meeting Lucy Snowe. And who is Lucy Snowe? And is Lucy Snowe letting us into her story completely? And the answer, honestly, is no. And that is evident in the book itself and alluded to in the text. I will admit that I was one of those people in the audience. I was not the only one that was definitely laughing at kind of like nudge, nudge, wink, wink allusions to the text. And I definitely think that there is something to be gained from having read the book in terms of the play and being in conversation with the works. But I don't think you lose anything if you haven't read the book and you go, especially if you were attracted to period pieces in particular. And I think that this offers a really dynamic staging and interpretation for a book that isn't excessively dynamic. This is a very internal book. We have a heroine with incredible tragedy in her past that is clearly avoiding really dealing with a lot of things. This is a lot more psychological than I think even I anticipated. And so even though Lucy is telling us her story directly, both on page and on stage, we as an audience or as a reader can't necessarily trust her. She is not a reliable narrator. For instance, in the book, she will not allude at all to potential connections or infatuations that we pick up on much later. And maybe I admittedly was just slow on picking up on some of that, although I am always looking for a romantic angle. And on the stage, we were able to see that subterfuge play out a little bit more. It wasn't overwrought or over the top, but it added this extra layer of vulnerability to Lucy because she is keeping so much of this so tight. And so the staging and the script involve a lot of talking directly to the audience, which I'm gonna admit to you, a lot of times I'm really on the fence about. It either really works for me or it really doesn't, and here it really worked for me. And I think a lot of it comes down to how it's being utilized and whether it feels like it's just being info dumpy and whether it's fully utilizing the theatricality. Like, is the direct audience address being used as a way to get around limitations of the space actively, or is it just being kind of used as a crutch, if that makes sense? And here it was a very active thing because we had her telling us her story, but she was also kind of working it out. She was in direct conversation with the audience. There were times where the actress made direct eye contact and in a way that didn't freak me out. And maybe it's because I was familiar with the material. Maybe it's because the actress Mi Kang was just so engaging and kind of gentle in her energy, and not in that she wasn't strong and forward with this character, especially because Lucy has some really acerbic bits later in the book and the show, and they're a great kind of balance to this character and kind of go back to Lucy as a character and being something different than we've seen as well, because she is very timid and lost in a lot of ways, but she is also very strong and forward in others. And so there is this great balance to her that is found in this production. And so part of this kind of subterfuge and getting around this is she is again telling us this story directly, but it plays with the ideas of beginnings and endings, which is directly textual in terms of the kind of final chapter of the book. And it calls this out later, where she kind of makes reference to, I told you this wasn't going to be a straight story, but there's also like these tongue-in-cheek references to, oh, you didn't think I would introduce people that weren't important later, right? Because in the book, we start out with the Bretons, who are her godmother and like this kind of family friends, we assume. And so we have this kind of extended period with them before we catch back up with her later and find out that she's been through some more hardships of some kind, and we go abroad. And so there are these kind of extended passages where we as readers are being kind of kept in the dark about some of these connections and what comes full circle. Now, as a reader, this didn't necessarily throw me off because 19th century literature is very famous for this, kind of having these extended periods. And we'll see those characters later, sometimes much later, but they're usually relevant again. But it feels like this really odd diversion at the time. But also in the book, Lucy telling us this story directly makes those diversions subversions a lot more engaging in the book as well. And so in the play, when we're in these kind of moments, there are these references to the audience that make the story clear when we're in the story, but also, like I said, feel like they're in conversation with the book itself or with audience members who may have read the book in a really delightful way as well. But we are then moving through this story with Lucy, and Lucy is navigating this story. And the set is built as kind of two layers of these sliding doors or panels as the main playing space. And so these panels are getting moved by the actors, primarily Lucy, throughout this as they navigate this space, and we are moved through this story with them. And the publicity copy mentions this in relation to like Lucy choosing a door and making a decision about her future, kind of. At least that's the intent of the copy that I got. It is the spirit, not verbatim, clearly. But I was really drawn to these doors that I viewed more as panels because I think that they played into what Lucy was showing versus hiding. And I think that the way that the set was manipulated and how it opened up over the course of the play directly supports my interpretation, but theater is interpretation just as text is interpretation, obviously. So a lot of this journey with Lucy in both mediums is about her opening up because she has been so buttoned up, so repressed in a lot of ways. There's a scene in the book and the play where she kind of collapses into a gutter in despair, and it's easy for that to read as kind of comical or this kind of playing into like the fainting woman stereotype, but rather it really plays into this idea of we only know what Lucy is telling us, and we don't know how ragged she has run herself, we don't know how much she's letting us in, and how much she will admit to weakness. And along that line too, in kind of that subversion of expectations of kind of tropes of the time for the book, there is this like ghost nun that kind of lives on the periphery of this story, and it is so easy for that to read comically, and I think that's also one of the challenges. There were moments on stage where, I'm not gonna lie, it did feel like it read a little comical, but part of the book and the play is kind of trying to untangle if that is real or if that is just kind of a manifestation of Lucy's subconscious. Because like I said, this book is a lot more psychological than I anticipated, but it still does clearly have those tinges of the Gothic, even though this production in particular is really trying to separate Villette out from Jane Eyre. It makes reference to this not being the kind of story where there are people in attics, which I loved that line, but also was kind of like, dang it, because my favorite scene in the book, or the one that has stuck with me the most, is Lucy getting locked in the attic to practice these lines. She still was like forced into the play, but she wasn't locked in this weird, creepy attic, so I get it. But we do end up in the attic later, so I feel like we could have still made it work. But we have this kind of repetition of what kind of story this is. She tells us it's not that kind of story, and she mentions multiple times that it is not a fairy tale. And with these kind of lines, it's setting audience expectations to a certain extent, yes, even though I feel like we're still going to build expectations as we'll build them anyway, but it is also this kind of reinforcing for her as a character, trying to bring herself back. We see her kind of get her hopes up and rein herself in, pull back, not allow herself the permission to hope for things, presumably because she has been disappointed by loss in the past. And we don't know the full breadth of that. We're just seeing her kind of moving forward. And there is an incredible strength to her in that. She is kind of venturing out alone. And she's such a compelling character because she is such an everyman in some ways. She's not a great beauty, for instance. We see her kind of played off against this young girl in the school, Ginevra, who admittedly annoyed the patootie out of me in the book. I knew she was supposed to because she annoyed the patootie out of Lucy in the book, but also some of the best and most cutting lines we get from Lucy are to Ginevra, so it was fine. So we still got that in the play, and we got to watch some of Lucy's unspoken hopes play out for this more beautiful and crueler young girl. And I think that this starts to get into too some of the deviations from the text. So before I go further down the path of deviations from the text, because I do want to touch on that, I kind of want to go back to this whole production being centered around Lucy's story, which I know sounds silly to say because she is the protagonist and we are seeing things from her point of view, both in the book and the play, but she spends so much time kind of diverting our attention as a reader in the book especially, kind of cluing us into what's going on with the people around her, and she takes so long to kind of open up, even while she's still being intimate, and it feels like she's letting us into her kind of headspace. We realize later on, oh, she has been holding back. And so watching the set kind of open up over the course of this play was truly magical, and I think that that alludes to the kind of simple theatricality I'm talking about when I talk about this production, because there's no question that there is a decent budget in that set let me make that clear, but it's this kind of easy symbolism, and it also makes the story more active just from the kind of manipulation of the space. It gives these characters more to work with and more to interact with, and the actors, I want to be clear, did a lot of the legwork too in terms of these little moments, because we are moving through Lucy's story. She's telling us so much directly, and so often these actors are coming on for these little blips of a moment, and they are always coming on with such purpose. They are making those moments land. They're not like dragging the moments or kind of wallowing in them, but they are finding purpose in every beat on that stage in a way that helps keep things feeling active and moving forward, and letting us as an audience find this joy and humor in moments, and also this incredible well of empathy in other moments. And I think that that speaks to the real specificity and intention of the production, because it would be so easy for this to feel meandering. And I think that the cuts are actually what help forward a lot of this and keep it active and keep it focused. And because it's been a couple of years since I read the source material, I'm not as married to anything necessarily. Cuts to the text aren't personal at this point. And I really wanted to talk about this specifically because I think so often we go back to things like the Brontes and Austen and whatnot, and we take the text as the end-all be-all, right? For instance, Persuasion. Now, I'm not saying the most recent Persuasion was successful, because I don't think it was, because I don't think it was specific enough. I don't think it was clear enough with its vision. But I don't think changes to the text, if done purposefully and to serve the story being told, aren't inherently bad. And I think that this production in particular is an illustration of that. Now, as always, this is subjective. I was talking to my designer friend after the show, I believe, and he had mentioned that he had sat by an audience member earlier in the previews who was upset about some of these cuts. But I think that they ultimately serve the story and Lucy's story. Like I said, she's trying to distract us from so much. And they also help the story in the current moment. So one of the biggest and most egregious cuts, probably for people who have read the book, is that Polly is not an actor on the stage. She is referenced, but we don't see her. And I agree with this choice, because I think that we get so distracted with Polly, or Lucy even gets so distracted with Polly, that it would take away from Lucy's story. And keep in mind, we're in the theater. This is a play that is already running over 2 hours in a world where theater has often kind of moved into this 90-minute realm, even before our attention spans were impacted by the pandemic. And so it streamlines the story, and that it's Lucy's story. And sure, she's important to Lucy, but I just think that it really helps. And it might be a moment of, okay, why are we cutting Polly when Ginevra is the actual worst? But because she's the worst, one, she provides a foil for Lucy, and two, she's just a lot more fun to watch. Additionally, as modern audiences, because this was my biggest concern going in, Polly meets Lucy and the Bretons as a child, and they all kind of meet again when Lucy and Polly are young women, some younger than others. And spoiler alert, but not really, John ends up with Polly, who he met as a child. And I feel like, especially in a theater space where we don't have like the kind of hundreds of pages, the real sense that time has passed, the sense that they're meeting again as adults and are strangers at the outset, don't make that connection right away, all of that. The things that kind of make that a little bit easier to swallow, we wouldn't have the same sense of that in the theater space. It would be a major hurdle to get audiences over, and it just makes sense not to waste too much time with that. We still get allusions to it. Lucy still mentions that early visit, but it's not something that feels as direct to us, and so we are still focused on Lucy's story, and we can kind of keep it moving. Now, I did have moments where I did have to kind of sit back and ask myself if I was as invested as I was, if the cuts didn't bother me as much because I already knew the story and I could see what was kind of taking shape. And I guess the cuts wouldn't have impacted that as much, but whether the story was still as active for an outside eye. And I can't speak to that to its full breadth, right? Because there is still a lot of kind of zigging in and out, and Lucy's story isn't necessarily a straight shot. It is still largely internal, even on the stage, even if we are bringing that internal and making it a lot more physical. We are maneuvering it. We are making it visual in a way that we can't on the page. It is still about Lucy making these choices and opening herself up.
and the hurt that comes with that. And I found it very interesting that we were telling this story at this moment. Now, going back to the playbill, I realized that this has been in the works for a while. It's been in development according to a conversation with the playwright that I read since I want to say around 2014, and it's just getting produced now. And I find that really interesting because I too have been drawn to this material for a long time, but I found it really interesting that it was being produced now because it felt so pertinent to now. We have this protagonist who feels so alone and isolated after a lot of grief and unspoken grief, and kind of having to go back into the world and make sense of it and open herself up to heartbreak and pain potentially. And that feels very prevalent right now. Now, I know these feelings are kind of evergreen and that people are always kind of feeling this way or dealing with this to some degree, but it really feels like it's speaking to the current moment in a very specific way. So I was actually very interested to hear that this has been planned for a while because it felt so intentional for the now. So in some ways, I'm glad this was delayed because I think it's going to hit audiences different now than even 5 years ago. And I'm not saying that it lives in this kind of despair and melancholy, but that is what we are climbing out of. And we watch her kind of burying these feelings once very literally, but we also see the magic and light as she opens herself up, even knowing that the ending, as she has alluded to, isn't going to be a fairy tale. And this brings us to the end, which I think is actually very textually rooted, and I'm going to try to avoid spoilers, explicit spoilers here. But I don't think I realized until I was like flipping through the book on the train home how much of Lucy's final monologue seemed like it was pulled directly from the text, and I was getting teared up, I'm not gonna lie, especially because there was a physical moment, a visual moment that alluded to the original ending of the book. One of the most famous parts of this book is that it ends very open-ended. And I think that it probably says a lot about me that I have misremembered the exact ending both times I've read this, looking back on it later. Like my brain clings to that hopeful out that we're given, and the staging of that alludes to the reality of what happened to Charlotte Bronte's originally intended ending. She switched to the more open-ended and leaving us with this moment. And I think that it worked together so well because there is that sense that we are lying to ourselves in some ways by going with the more hopeful option, but also that that's not necessarily a bad thing, that hope is something that we choose. And so we are seeing in this final moment moving towards something. And I'm not gonna lie to you, I was tearing up at this point and I thought I was gonna make it through. And then they pulled the most famous, or a portion of the most famous quote from Villette, which I don't believe happens at the ending. And for some reason, I did not tab it in my reread of this book because the first time I read the book wasn't this edition. This is just one of my favorite Bronte quotes, and I couldn't find where exactly in the book it happens through like a kind of cursory Google search. So if you know, please let me know because I want to mark it in my book. But they moved it to the end here, and I think it really fits because we were brought into this story with this idea that we're going into this tale that's not exactly linear, even if I feel like they could have played that up a little bit in the script because it was pretty linear overall, admittedly, but it was this idea of how we're moving in and around the story because it wasn't necessarily a memory play because we weren't, well, she was walking into the story, but we weren't presenting it necessarily as memory, even if we ended at this moment. I don't know. I'm not going to count it. You can count it as a memory play if you want. We were still kind of navigating that space together. But this quote, I think, really speaks to the heart of the story. So not only is it just a quote that I love, but it just hit so hard in this moment and kind of distilled the journey we had been on with Lucy. And that is, if I can get through this without getting teared up because I am a sentimental fool, I believe in some blending of hope and sunshine sweetening the worst lots. I believe that this life is not all, neither the beginning nor the end. I believe while I tremble, I trust while I weep. And it's that last bit. My friend Mandy and I looked at each other, because of course I brought Mandy because this book has been so central to our friendship somehow. And we just looked at each other and we had that damn it look on our face. And the actress was like in the aisle, and the aisle we were sitting in, which is another thing I generally don't like, but I loved this actress, so maybe that was part of it. But I was just like, don't look at me. don't look at me. So it was just such a stellar piece of theater, and it really just reemphasized the way that different mediums offer different windows into stories. This story can only be told on stage. Sure, it could be filmed, but it would be experienced a little differently on the screen, and I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, and I definitely don't think that that means that we shouldn't be getting more filmed theater, making that more accessible. But even if we were to watch like the filmed version of a stage production on screen, there's a different kind of suspension of disbelief in that than for like a Netflix or a Hulu series. That being said, I think even with TV and movies, especially with things like Bridgerton, creatives finding new ways into stories and finding what works in the book and pulling it out and distilling it for a different medium. Because the story is going to be told differently across different mediums. For instance, there's a lot cut in the play. They're the same story from different angles. And I wouldn't say either is better than the other, but especially in conversation with each other, there is just such a beautiful harmony there, and I love that kind of intertextuality, that conversation across space and time. And so I think that there was something really joyful in that, and even though I know that many of you probably won't be able to experience this particular production, I just wanted to kind of chat through the different ways we can approach storytelling and how that can change, and what kind of factors go into some of this. So apologies if any of this was too much or not enough, but I definitely think that it is an interesting conversation, especially in context of a lot of the adaptations we're talking about and will be talking about this year as well. So if you have read Villette, I would be really interested to hear your thoughts, especially about Lucy Snow as a protagonist. I would love to hear your thoughts about how you think this would work up on its feet and what you would find engaging in such a production. If you've seen this particular production, I would love to hear your thoughts because I really, really enjoyed it. I thought all of the design really enhanced and worked together to tell the story that the script was telling. I thought all of the acting choices were incredibly grounded and were able to let us into these characters in a little bit of space. And sure, there were still things I missed, but at the end of the day, I think this was a really excellent and successful distilling of the thing. So let me know what you're thinking, like and subscribe if you feel like it, read something good, and yeah, bye.